Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining the Policy Lab webinar series. Policy Lab is a research center within Children's Hospital of Philadelphia's Research Institute. Our care for children and families drives our research, informing practice and policy to improve child health. This webinar series is just one of the many tools we use to translate the work under our 5 research portfolios into evidence-based policy solutions at the local, state, and federal levels. Today, we'll be focusing on the current landscape of e-cigarette use among adolescents and how we can address this evolving issue through policy and practice with Dr. Brian Jensen, a faculty member at Policy Lab, assistant professor of pediatrics at the University of Pennsylvania Perelman School of Medicine, a primary care pediatrician at CHOP, and the medical director of value-based care for CHOP's Care Network. I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Jensen to get us started.
Thank you, Laura. So before I start, I always like to start with my disclosure slide. I have no relevant conflict of interest to disclose, including the fact that I have no ownership in tobacco and/or e-cigarette companies. Our learning objectives for today will describe the trends in adolescent and youth e-cigarette use and the associated adverse health impacts, including what use can mean for risk of contracting COVID-19. We'll discuss recent evolving public health efforts to curb the epidemic of youth vaping. And then at the end, hopefully you'll be able to develop intervention strategies and messages regarding e-cigarettes that can be used in clinical and community settings with adolescents and young adults. Here are our overview. We're going to start with the shifting landscape of adolescent tobacco use. First, whenever I give these talks, I always like to start with this kind of main issue, the overall toll of combustible tobacco. Smoking remains is the leading cause of preventable disease and death in the United States. More than 480,000 deaths every year are because of smoking cigarettes. 1 of 5 deaths, that's 1 of 3 cancer deaths in the US. Adult smokers die 10 years earlier than their non-smoking peers. We've made tremendous strides in the United States reducing adult cigarette use. Still, 14% of the US adult population smokes. That's 34 million adults over the age of 18. And those 34 million adults regularly expose 58 million non-smokers to all the harms of secondhand smoke. And within that, 40% of children aged 3 to 11 are regularly exposed to secondhand smoke. If that was not enough, there's more than $300 billion in healthcare costs attributable to tobacco every year. And finally, kind of as an introduction, I'd like to remind people that cigarettes are the only legal product on the marketplace that when you use them as intended, they will kill you. That's a kind of a very shameful category to be in. Tobacco use starts during adolescence. 9 out of 10 cigarette smokers start before the age of 18. Why do teens use tobacco? Well, first and foremost, nicotine is incredibly addictive. It causes biochemical changes in the brain, and it creates this cycle of tolerance and withdrawal symptoms that really feed forward the idea that you continue to need the nicotine. Also, there's a long history of tobacco companies targeting children with ads and flavors. And it's reinforced by social cues, seeing, for example, parents or friends smoke. And as we've known, youth, in particular kind of teenagers and young adults, are more susceptible to addiction than their older peers. When it comes to cigarette smoking, we've made tremendous strides in the United States, just like for adult users. Showing you here on the graph on the left, cigarette smoking among high school students. Back in the 1970s, almost 40% of high school students regularly smoked cigarettes. That's represented by the red line on that graph. Now we've seen a dramatic decline to less than 10%. In fact, when we narrow in more recently, for the most recent data collected up until 2019, fewer than 6% of high school students regularly use cigarettes. Huge, tremendous strides. How did we get to this dramatic decline? Well, there have been major efforts, and this is a whole other discussion, but just to give you kind of a sense of them, major efforts including public education campaigns, U.S. Surgeon General reports that highlighted the scientific evidence showing the harms of cigarette smoking, bans on television advertising, restriction on sales and marketing to youth, state and federal tax laws, something called the U.S. Master Settlement Agreement, in which Big Tobacco was forced to settle, taking funds to the states, giving funds to the states to help kind of push back against Big Tobacco. The Tobacco Control Act, in which the FDA has regulatory authority over all tobacco products. And finally, most recently, Tobacco 21, which we'll talk more briefly about, the idea of increasing the purchase age of tobacco from 18 to 21. Now, while we made huge strides in reducing cigarette use, these products, new products, came on the market challenging these trends. In particular, you're showing your JUUL here. When JUUL first came on the marketplace, they were there to kind of argue that they're out to target kind of adult users to help them quit smoking. But what we're going to go into, that's been patently false from the get-go. And there's been a dramatic rise of e-cigarette use over the last 5 years, especially since JUUL came on the marketplace. From data from 2019, more than a quarter of high school students regularly use e-cigarettes. And when you look at middle school students, more than 1 in 10 were regularly using these cigarettes. From the most recent data up until the rise of the COVID epidemic, from the 2020 National Youth Tobacco Survey that was just published back in September, school-based survey of current e-cigarette use that was up until March of 2020, so again, right before COVID, we've seen improvements from the 2019 data. 20% of high school students, that's still 1 in 5 high school students, and 5% of middle school students currently use e-cigarettes. And one of the problems has been persistent frequent use among current users. Almost 40% of high school students who use e-cigarettes use them on more than 20 of the past 30 days. And of that, of those who report current use, 23, almost 1 in 4 high school students report daily use. Why the rise to epidemic levels? Well, first off, what are e-cigarettes? Well, they're a handheld device that produces an aerosol that's inhaled by the user. They contain a solution of nicotine, flavoring chemicals, propylene glycol, and other. These products are still not effectively regulated by the FDA, so that's why it's always important to emphasize they include chemicals that are both advertised and not advertised to the user. And they include a whole bunch of different terms, like vapes, mods, tanks, and pod systems like JUUL. I'm showing you on the right-hand side here different images of the initial products that look like cigarettes to the more third-generation e-cigarettes that look more like tank devices. But what really has come to dominate the marketplace has been JUUL and similar devices, also showing you Sorin and kind of other vape pod devices. E-cigarettes are sold nearly everywhere, in vape shops, convenience stores, gas stations, retail outlets, mall kiosks, grocery stores, and internet vendors. So they're kind of ubiquitous in the availability for teenagers to get access to them. I mentioned earlier, when JUUL first came on the marketplace, they argued that they were here to help adult smokers quit. But the fact is, from the get-go, from their launch campaign, they were targeting children, adolescents, and young adults, individuals who had most likely never started cigarettes in the first place. Looking at the images I'm showing you here, it doesn't look like these are the typical adult established smoker one thinks of. I do a lot of work to help adult established smokers quit, help parents quit smoking. They tend to be people in their 20s, but more often 30s, 40s, and 50s. These don't look like adult established smokers. And from the get-go, JUUL has targeted children and adolescents via social media and via sponsored ads and paid influencers. This is a particular ad that a large percentage of middle school and high school students saw back when this first came out in 2018. And this was from this person was paid. They made it seem like it was spontaneous, but this was a paid influencer. And the roots of the JUUL advertisements are in traditional tobacco ads. You see kind of attractive women in provocative poses, just as you see with JUUL on the left, with the cool campaign on the right, a prominent cigarette company. Similarly, you'd see health reassurance ads. JUUL saying that this is smoking evolved. On the right here, and you see Lorillard talking about how filters helped make these products safer, which is patently untrue. Filters have no impact on the dramatic health risk of cigarettes. Further, you often see the whole idea of young people having fun. On the left, again, the JUUL launch campaign. On the right, one of the most successful Newport ads of a variety of people out playing baseball smoking. And JUUL and e-cigarette companies have pushed false advertising to our profession, to the medical profession, and to the public, making these false claims that vaping is 95% healthier and 40% cheaper than smoking. It might be cheaper, but there's unclear evidence about it actually being healthier. And the idea of quantifying it is entirely misleading. It took 40 years for cigarette smoking, for the information to be collected and analyzed to tease out that cigarette smoking caused lung cancer. And so to make a claim that e-cigarettes are somehow 95% healthier when they've only been on the marketplace for 5 years and we don't know the real long-term health impact, again, is entirely misleading. And JUUL, because of their targeting and their unique way of kind of going after adolescents and young adults, they've come to dominate the marketplace. From the most recent data showing that more than 75% of the market is dominated by JUUL. So when we think of the vaping e-cigarette adolescent epidemic, what this really is a JUULing epidemic, an epidemic among adolescents and young adults using one particular product, JUUL. From colleagues at Stanford, they looked at the advertising that came in of JUUL from their get-go. And what they found was that from their initial launch, they've been targeting youth, as I mentioned. An analysis of JUUL ads via Stanford, looking at their website, their social media channels, their promotion materials, this whole idea that it was meant for adult smokers only has not been congruent with their marketing practices. A direct quote from their report. They've been patently youth-oriented from the get-go. And they've been doing things that are illegal for cigarette companies to be doing, offering scholarships to children as young as in elementary school and middle school to write essays saying how JUUL is safe and everyone should switch to JUUL or use JUUL. And they've been sponsoring musical festivals and events, again, illegal for tobacco companies to do, because those sort of things targeting youth have been shown to be so effective in traditional cigarette advertising promotion, enticing children in and hooking them to their products. In addition to the targeted marketing and advertisement, they've been using appealing flavors that have been shown to entice children and teens, using unique flavors like fruit, candy, and dessert flavors. And flavors have been the main reason for youth e-cigarette use, partly because of the belief that there's potentially less harmful, but also because they're enticing. Because we have so much data, 30 years of data, especially from other tobacco products that have shown that flavors in tobacco products encourage youth experimentation, regular use, and addiction. And that's led to this dramatic rise of JUUL culture. I mentioned the attractive scented flavors, but they also appeal to a wide audience. They have this sleek, modern design, and they come packaged like a smartphone with customizable covers, easy to purchase and use. You can buy them online, open the starter kit, and then slide a flavor pod into the device and start vaping. And they're really easy to conceal from authority figures. That's why we hear so often in our work with schools and school administrators and parents that teens, as this kind of image mock-up shows, teens are in the back of the classroom quickly vaping and then concealing it from their teachers. And what's so important for everyone to know, if they didn't already, is that JUUL is big tobacco. So when JUUL first came on the marketplace, they were independent, but they've now been bought by Philip Morris, the makers of Marlboro. So when we talk about e-cigarette companies, JUUL and every major e-cigarette company is now owned by a big tobacco company. Next, what do we know about the health harms? First off, in terms of e-cigarettes and a secondhand aerosol, there are known harmful toxicants and carcinogens that are found in these emissions. Heavy metals, cancer-causing chemicals, formaldehyde, and nicotine. These aerosols are not safe. In fact, the aerosol may impair fetal growth and lung development, and this is based off of mouse model data. Further, based on studies of actual adolescents, we found that toxicants are found in the bodies of teen users. In particular, 5 volatile organic compounds, what are called VOCs, have been found in the urine and saliva of teen users at much higher levels in users compared to controls. And what we know about these particular VOCs, lifelong exposure to them is strongly associated with increased risk of cancer. So we know the aerosol is unsafe, and we know that the chemicals found in the bodies of users are known to cause cancer. What about other health harms? Well, it takes time, as I mentioned earlier, to do studies on kind of the long-term health harms of any sort of new product that comes in the marketplace. So it takes time to investigate these new products. But what we already know is concerning. There seems to be an increased asthma risk of e-cigarette users, more so than cigarette users, and much higher than non-e-cigarette or cigarette users. There's also some evidence that suggests impaired immune response, potential increased risk of seizures, and this whole new lung syndrome, which I'll speak more about later. So it seems that e-cigarettes are on their own risk profile separate from cigarettes. There's also been this dramatic rise in acute injuries. As I mentioned earlier, these devices are not regulated. There's no quality control. there's been, as far as we know, at least one death in Texas from an explosion that severed the young adult's carotid artery. And from the most recent data collected, there have been at least 195 incidents attributable to vape explosions, but it's most likely an underestimate. I'm showing you an image from a case report in the New England Journal of Medicine in which the vape device exploded in the individual's mouth and severed their jawbone, severed their mandible. There's also been this dramatic rise in what's referred to as e-cigarette or vaping product use associated lung injury, EVALI. There have been more than 28 hospitalizations from when they started in June 2019 up until June 2020, the most recent time that the CDC was collecting the data across the United States in all 50 states, and more than 68 deaths. It seems like what the CDC is no longer focused on these cases right now, understandably kind of focused more on COVID, but these cases are still occurring, and it's most likely underreport from COVID. There have been more cases reported in California and as well in Minnesota. And what these really look like is chemical injuries to the lungs that are similar to industrial worker exposure to harmful chemicals like toluene or benzene. So what it's looking like is that people are inhaling these harmful chemicals. What do we know further about it? Well, all the reports of individuals with this lung disease were using an e-cigarette device. The majority seem to be both using THC, marijuana, and nicotine products, and in particular counterfeit THC that contain product that was most reported by an individual brand. Majority of them are younger than the age of 25 in terms of the patients affected, more men than women, and they typically have symptoms of cough, shortness of breath, chest pain, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, fever, and abdominal pain. And in a sample of patients that were analyzed, in a sample of 51, the majority of them, the vast majority of them, had a particular compound, vitamin E acetate, that seems to be the most likely causative agent. But what do we don't know about EVALI? Well, it takes time to identify and characterize a new condition, and we need ongoing epidemiologic investigation. And there are many substances under investigation still, so it's most likely more than one cause. And we have no real information about the long-term prognosis. Most of these patients are hospitalized and admitted to intensive care units, and it's unclear what this means to their long-term lung function. Also, there seems to be some evidence of individuals who use e-cigarettes are at greater risk of developing COVID. A COVID-19 diagnosis is associated with teen e-cigarette use from a recent study just published in the Journal of Adolescent Health. What they did was they took a survey of more than 4,000 young adults, 13 to 24, and they found that a diagnosis was 5 to 7 times more likely in e-cigarette users only and e-cigarette and cigarette dual users. The limitations, though, is based on self-report. It was interesting that there was no association with cigarette use found, and so it's unclear, is it something this product is doing to individual lungs that increases their risk of getting COVID, or is it the way the product is used? For example, many teens use a JUUL device and pass it back and forth, so there might be something about the socialization aspect in which they're sharing saliva via the particular device that increases their risk of contracting COVID. Nonetheless, there does seem to be this strong association between e-cigarette use and a COVID diagnosis. Additionally, and more concerning in many ways, there seems to be these real big issues of nicotine exposure from e-cigarettes in adolescent development. During adolescence, there's intense development in brain regions that focus on motivation, impulsivity, and addiction. And exposure is known to cause addiction, mood issues, and attention problems. Nicotine is incredibly addictive, more addictive than other drugs of abuse that we typically get concerned about, including marijuana, alcohol, and cocaine. In fact, there's some evidence that nicotine in particular increases the risk of addiction for other drugs. So it's almost priming the brain for addiction to both nicotine and other substances of abuse. And because of this relationship between nicotine, one of the most concerning findings, in addition to all these other health harms, is that e-cigarette users transition to become cigarette users. Multiple long-term studies have found the remarkably consistent finding that e-cigarette users have a 4 times increased risk of going on to smoke cigarettes. And the association seems to be higher for low-risk teens, meaning teens that were not at increased risk of becoming cigarette smokers. So what gets those in the public health community, which should get us all concerned, is there's a potential to addict a whole new generation to nicotine, a whole new generation to tobacco. And JUUL in particular is a high nicotine delivery system. 1 pod of JUUL has the same amount of nicotine in 20 cigarettes. And that's 2 to 10 times higher than earlier e-cigarette devices. And you get this nicotine exposure without the adverse user experience. That's why we often see on social media that 80% of the individuals using JUUL continue to use JUUL, and a common post is addicted to my JUUL. And what's so concerning, this JUUL systems, which are high nicotine delivery systems, those previous studies I mentioned about the clear increased risk of e-cigarette users transitioning to become cigarette smokers, that was really before JUUL came on the marketplace. So the concern is that JUUL is only going to worsen this association between transition between e-cigarette use and cigarette use. And it remains this misconception among adolescents that e-cigarette devices don't contain nicotine. Well, JUUL always contains nicotine, and the majority of teens still don't understand this. Next, let's talk about the potential role in helping adult smokers quit combustible tobacco. First off, we always need to have caution when big tobacco is kind of pushing a particular thread about their part of the solution where they've always been and will remain the problem. E-cigarettes are not FDA approved for smoking cessation. There have been a limited number of small randomized controlled trials, and they're not endorsed by U.S. public health groups. And there's a lot of conflicting evidence. There's some evidence that suggests e-cigarettes may increase the risk of not quitting. And I'm showing you a picture here from the early 20th century, when doctors used to recommend cigarettes. We do not want to be in that position when we as physicians, as providers, those in the public health space, are recommending a product that might actually hurt people in the long run. There's some evidence, as I mentioned, that using e-cigarettes may actually decrease the chance of quitting. What I'm showing you is a study from 2016, a forest plot which summarized all the different studies and actually found that the odds of quitting smoking was 28% lower in e-cigarette users compared with non-e-cig users. And few adults actually use e-cigarettes. From the most recent data, fewer than 5% of adults over the age of 25 actually vape, compared to more than 20-25% of adolescents that vape. So again, this is an adolescent issue, an adolescent epidemic. It's not like a huge percentage of adults are actually using these products. There is one very well-designed randomized control trial that I want to speak to, both the strengths and the limitations of it. And this was a pragmatic randomized control trial among almost 900 participants in the UK, in which they were randomized, to one of two options, either e-cigarettes or nicotine replacement therapy. And then they both received counseling. And what they did was they looked at 1 year, their biologically confirmed quit rates. And they found that in the e-cigarette group, 18% of individuals went on to quit. In the nicotine replacement therapy group, patch or gum, about 10%. So it shows you that there's potential here. Limitations of this, though. In the e-cigarette group, 80% of them were still using e-cigarettes at 1 year. So is this really a path to completely getting people off combustible tobacco, or are they at risk of continuing to use nicotine and then get sucked back towards tobacco? And we're seeing in that in some of kind of the qualitative studies that are starting to come out. In the nicotine replacement therapy group, only 9% were still using nicotine replacement therapy. So the majority of people who actually quit were then completely nicotine and tobacco free. One other note, which is different about this study, these particular e-cigarette devices, one was able to kind of dial down your nicotine over time, which is something that's not available by the major e-cigarette companies in the United States. When we talk about smoking cessation, we have all these other options, multiple strategies that are effective. There's substantial evidence from many, many randomized controlled trials, more than 150, that show all these things I'm showing you on the screen are effective in helping adult users quit smoking. The quit line, in a given year, about 5% of adult smokers will go on to quit without using any particular evidence-based strategy. But you can increase those quit rates if you use things like the quit line, which is counseling available over the phone. Physician counseling can bump up those quit rates to 20%. Using nicotine replacement therapy can bump up those rates to 25 to even as high 30% range. And then things like Chantix, varenicline, and bupropion, Zyban also dramatically increase the likelihood of helping individuals quit smoking. Overall, there's this kind of thread for adult smokers. Are e-cigarettes potentially safer than cigarettes? If you had to choose between the two, only if you're an adult established smoker. There's some evidence that if you completely switch to e-cigarettes from cigarettes, it theoretically, with some evidence, reduces your exposure to toxicants and carcinogens, also reduces some of the short-term adverse health outcomes, may also have an impact on secondhand smoke exposure. decreasing nicotine and the particulates from e-cigarettes are lower compared to those in cigarettes. But it's important to kind of not get sucked into a thread, into a message that's being promoted by tobacco companies. Just because they're safer doesn't mean they're safe. As I started this talk, I reminded individuals that cigarettes are the only legal product in the marketplace that when you use them as intended, they will kill you. It's a really low bar to prove something is safer than a cigarette. What we really need to do when we think about the larger public health context and how we appropriately regulate these products and protect children and adult users of cigarettes, we need to kind of think in these terms. Tobacco use causes disease, disability, and death. Imagine tobacco use is a highway, and when you're on that highway, ultimately you're going to die from your tobacco use. Regulation is needed and appropriate when e-cigarettes cause more youth to start combustible tobacco use, and when e-cigarettes don't actually get people preventing them from quitting. So when you think about kind of on and off ramps. So the whole idea here is if they're in the bigger public health context, if they're actually enticing more people in to cigarettes and preventing people from quit, we need strong regulation to protect especially adolescents and youth, as well as established adult smokers. Finally, let's talk about public health and treatment. In terms of regulation right now, the FDA has regulatory authority over all tobacco products since 2009, but they've delayed appropriate action. They were all set to regulate e-cigarettes just like other tobacco products. They were all set to do that in August 2017, and they delayed that regulation to 2022. Since that time, there's plenty of evidence to suggest they've kind of recognized somewhat the errors of their way. In fall 2018, they identified and called the youth e-cigarette use an epidemic. They opened up a federal investigation into JUUL. And last summer, in the summer of 2019, they talked about there are currently no authorized e-cigarette companies, e-cigarettes currently on the marketplace. And then in the winter, spring of 2020, prior to the pandemic, they removed some flavors, but there were significant exemptions. Still flavors are available in JUUL, and then the mom and pop stores in which they're kind of mixing their own flavors, those were exempt from these flavor bans. So when you might have seen headlines saying, oh, flavors have been removed, they have not. They're still available to youth and adolescents. But there are groups that are pushing back against e-cigarettes. There have been a whole bunch of investigative reports exposing that JUUL had all these education programs, all these ways that they were targeting children illegally. Further, all these claims by JUUL that they can help adult smokers quit have been not supported by any sort of scientific evidence. They've never submitted their product to the FDA for approval. They have no product in which it's designed to promote tapering. It's one set amount of nicotine and a really high amount of nicotine at that. And they've never asked for independent support from scientists to help evaluate their product and its efficacy in helping adult established smokers quit. So the American Academy of Pediatrics and other partners have sued FDA, highlighting their delays in regulating e-cigarettes, delays in putting on warning labels, and all these other things that the FDA has delayed doing, saying there's been an express and deliberate abdication of the FDA's responsibility. And what they were able to do, they successfully won a lawsuit, and in that lawsuit, all e-cigarettes must apply for FDA review back in September, just last month, which had been delayed because of COVID-19. We don't know what this means right now. The FDA has sent letters to individual groups that have not applied for FDA for review, but we're going to see more time as to what the FDA does in terms of handling these products. The idea is that we need to keep pushing for the FDA to appropriately regulate these products. Now, while the FDA has in many ways failed in its responsibility to help protect youth and adolescents from e-cigarettes, other groups, and there have been other efforts that have successfully pushed back. Here I'm showing you is the most recent, really important public health effort called Tobacco 21, which is now the law of the land back from December 2019, meaning that in the United States, you have to be 21 to purchase any single tobacco product. The reason why this happened is because preventing use has been and will remain our most effective treatment tool. The vast majority of individuals who purchase for under 18-year-olds are under 21. They're the ones who purchase the majority of tobacco for minors. And there have been reports that show that raising the age to 21 could lead to a dramatic decrease, as much as 12% decline in smoking. And because of this, because most people want to quit and most people want to push back against tobacco, there's been strong support across the United States, across a whole bunch of different kind of political and age affiliations. The majority of Republicans, Democrats, not affiliated, the majority of individuals, regardless of their age, even individuals who smoke, the vast majority of them support the idea of increasing the purchase age from 18 to 21. That's how it led through this grassroots effort, state by state, jurisdiction, up to becoming a federal law back in December. There's also been e-cigarette pushes for regulation at the local level, at the state and local policies, incorporating them into current smoke-free policies, preventing access, pricing and taxing policies, incorporating them into local jurisdiction, local kind of regulatory authority, regulation of the marketing, and a whole bunch of different educational initiatives. What I'm showing you on this map here, that's trying to summarize the different jurisdictions, there's still a lot that needs to happen. A lot of different states that can, real states and local jurisdictions that need to essentially regulate e-cigarettes just like they regulate cigarettes, all because those are effective ways of helping protect non-users from cigarettes and e-cigarettes, and also helping protect youth and adolescents from getting enticed into these products. There have been more recent examples of local jurisdictions pushing back. San Francisco has recently banned JUUL in their jurisdiction. Michigan became the first state to ban flavored e-cigarettes. And then locally, where we're based in Philadelphia, Philadelphia has set to restrict flavored e-cigarettes and, in fact, any flavored tobacco product in the jurisdiction of Philadelphia. Now, outside of state and local and federal policy, what else? What else do we need to make sure that we're doing to help push back? Well, when we look at broad messaging, one of the first things we should think about is what doesn't work. The Just Say No campaign and the DARE campaign, those campaigns have been shown to not be effective. They're very authoritarian, and teens did not respond well to them. In fact, those broad messaging campaigns may have actually increased youth awareness and experimentation with drugs and tobacco products. Why? Well, because they spark curiosity, create this false sense of use rates. If someone is talking about this is your brain on drugs, man, I must be kind of abnormal if I'm not kind of using these products. Again, that feeling of being kind of different, if you're not using drugs. So that messaging campaign did not work. What did and what does? Well, things like the Truth campaign, which has prevented hundreds of thousands of teens from ever smoking. Showing you an image from one of their early campaigns back in 2000, where they focused on exposing the lies of the tobacco industry. That particular campaign, if you can see, was body bags that were put in front of the tobacco company headquarters in Manhattan, showing the number of individuals dying every day from the lies and manipulation tactics of big tobacco. And what this campaign did was harness youthful rebellion. Not using drugs, the whole idea of that was maximizing youth freedom. A typical message might be, people your parents' age are trying to get you addicted to a product that you'll use for the rest of your life. Don't be a fool. Push back. Don't get sucked into tobacco and sucked into tobacco company manipulation. Other approaches, when we think about broad messaging, what about school-based approaches? Well, we have some evidence about what kind of needs to happen at a campus-wide level. First and foremost, we need to make sure that every school campus, whether they be kind of middle school, high schools, or colleges and universities, there needs to be a campus-wide tobacco e-cigarette ban. And in the case of when those products are found on campus, we need to confiscate the products and then refer teens who need help to treatment. There's no evidence that suspension potentially works, suspending a teen for being caught with an e-cigarette on a high school campus. And there's some evidence about developing curricula focused on social aspects to help teens push back, focus on why teens use tobacco products and how to remain tobacco-free, emphasizing the majority of teens don't use tobacco products. And then, as I mentioned earlier, talking about the line and manipulation of tobacco and e-cigarette companies and how not using tobacco maximizes youth freedom. There are a variety of new treatment programs that are available throughout the country. The first one on the left is from the Truth campaign. This is a text messaging program in which teens can text to get text messaging-based support. There's also quitline programs in which teens can call into or text to get both text messaging and counseling support available to them. Now, what about us as individual providers? I mentioned prevention is key, but what about treatment? What have been some lessons learned from cigarettes? Well, teen cigarette smokers want to quit. That's been kind of well established, but few teens seek help. And there are really limited evidence-based options for what's available to help teens. But pediatricians are positioned to intervene, and we should talk to teens about our concerns about these products. There's no current data on how to best treat teens for e-cigarette addiction. A large percentage want to quit, and there are some new targeted treatment options that are developing. For example, we have a trial at CHOP, but so far there's limited evidence to suggest these are working. But the idea is making sure that we kind of talk and try to engage teens who are particularly motivated. So those teens who are addicted to nicotine, what we need to make sure that we're doing is asking the right questions. Do you use a vaping or e-cigarette product like mods, pods, or JUULs? Making sure that we're using the terminology that teens use. You talk with youth about quitting, helping them kind of tease out ways using motivational interviewing as to why they started and how we can empower them to come up with their own plan to quit. And in helping youth make a quit plan, assessing their desire to quit, develop a plan, helping them anticipate challenges, connecting them to the treatment programs I mentioned before, and also consider nicotine replacement therapy. There's more information available from the link below from the American Academy of Pediatrics on that. But the idea is for teens who are particularly motivated and want to use nicotine replacement therapy, even though there's no clear evidence that it helps in terms of efficacy in helping individuals quit, and it's not FDA approved to use for individuals under the age of 18, nicotine replacement therapy itself is safe. And so there are plenty of opportunities for teens that want to use them to try and see if they could potentially help e-cigarette users get off these products. And then making sure you continue to follow up with these teens once you've initiated nicotine replacement therapy. So in conclusion, where are we right now in 2020 when it comes to kind of e-cigarettes, policy, recommendations, and treatment? Well, certainly there's strong evidence for policy and practices that we need to make sure that we continue to protect non-users, protecting users from the secondhand aerosol and all the harms, indirect harms from these products. And then we need to continue to help youth and adults live tobacco-free lives. E-cigarettes have clear harms to users and non-users, and policies are needed now. The FDA needs to effectively regulate e-cigarettes. We need to prevent targeting of youth and prevent nicotine addiction, and we can't afford to be complacent or only focus on this idea of cessation, and maybe these things can help adult smokers quit. In terms of combustible cigarettes, we can certainly come up with a way of potentially using these products if they are effective to help adult smokers quit. In the meantime, there's no reason that we should be allowing these companies to bypass appropriate regulatory authority and target youth, children, adolescents, and youth with their products. The most effective treatment option is always going to be prevention. Thank you for your time.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Jensen, for that informative presentation, and thanks so much to our viewers for watching this webinar.